The name of the German general was Kurt von der Chevallerie. In the third week of August, 1944, he was standing in front of a situation map that had stopped meaning anything. Chevallerie was not a small man in the Wehrmacht. He had commanded an army corps on the Eastern Front. He had fought at Kiev and at Velikie Luki. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. In the summer of 1944, he commanded the German First Army, and his task, as given to him by a chain of command that no longer quite believed its own orders, was to hold a line in central France against an American field army that had come into existence at noon on the first day of August. His front was fraying faster than he could redraw it. His units were being thrown into battle piecemeal along the Paris to Orléans Gap. They were building roadblocks that lasted minutes and not hours. An American intelligence officer on the other side, watching the same situation from the opposite end, would later write that what Chevallerie was doing was, in its way, a remarkable military feat. His enemies, not his own high command, would be the ones to say so. He kept falling back. There was no mass collapse. At every critical point he defended, and he delayed, and then he fell back again, because the American army he was facing was not moving at any speed the German textbook had ever been written to describe. On the 6th of September, 1944, Adolf Hitler would sack him. By April of 1945, he would be declared missing in action in the chaos of the Soviet advance near Kohlberg. He would never write a memoir. He would never explain, in his own words, what it had been like to stand in front of that map in August and watch the line dissolve. But 300 kilometers behind him, at the headquarters of the German Commander-in-Chief West, another general was reading the morning situation report. His name was Gunther Blumentritt, and in the years after the war, in an Allied holding facility where he would write several thousand pages of manuscript for American army historians, he would try to put into words the thing Chevallerie could not. Blumentritt had been chief of staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. He had seen the Wehrmacht at the height of its powers in 1940, when German panzer divisions crossed France in 6 weeks. He had seen the drive on Moscow in 1941. He knew what a fast army looked like. He had helped design one. What he said about the Americans who broke out of Normandy in August of 1944 was not flattering. It was the opposite of flattering. It was a professional surrender. He wrote that the Germans had regarded the American general opposite them as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. A man, he said, of incredible initiative and of lightning-like action. His operations, Blumentritt wrote, impressed the Germans enormously because he came closest to their own concept of the classical military commander. He even, Blumentritt added, improved on Napoleon's basic rule of war, which was activity, speed, and more speed. The general Blumentritt was describing had not attended a war college in Berlin. He had never commanded a panzer corps. He had, in the middle part of his career, specialized in horse cavalry. He had been publicly disgraced the year before the invasion of France for slapping 2 shell-shocked American soldiers in a Sicilian field hospital, and his own supreme commander had briefly considered sending him home. His name was Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., and between the first day of August, 1944, and the first days of September, he and his 3rd United States Army moved across a stretch of northern France faster than any German army had ever moved across the same ground, including the one Blumentritt had helped send there in 1940. That is the sentence this video is going to spend the next hour explaining. How an American general, in command of an army built largely of green divisions, using a doctrine the Germans had refined for more than a century, managed for one specific stretch of the summer of 1944 to outrun the men who had written that doctrine. The answer is not a single thing. It is several things braided together. Some of them are about a man who had spent 20 years in a small, sleepy American army reading German military books in his spare time. Some of them are about a truck driver from Louisiana who was not allowed to eat at a lunch counter in the country he was fighting for, but who drove 20 hours a day on a one-way highway across Normandy so that his Sherman tanks could keep rolling. Some of them are about a system of command that, by August of 1944, had quietly become everything the German army had stopped being able to be. And one of them is about the fact that the Wehrmacht of 1944 was no longer the Wehrmacht of 1940, and the men running it knew it, even when they could not say it out loud. We begin, though, with the man, because without the man, the rest of it does not happen the way it happened. George Patton was born on November 11, 1885, on a family ranch in San Gabriel, California. His father was a Virginia-educated lawyer with a Confederate military pedigree. His grandfather had died at the Third Battle of Winchester in the Civil War. The first books read to him as a child were not fairy tales. They were the Iliad, the histories of Napoleon, and the campaigns of the American Civil War. He learned to ride before he could comfortably read. He could not, in fact, read comfortably for a long time. He repeated his first year at West Point because he failed mathematics. He spelled badly, wrote slowly, and composed with visible effort. Biographers who came after him, beginning with Martin Blumenson and later Carlo d'Este, have argued that what he was struggling with was dyslexia, a condition not recognized in American medicine during his youth. Whatever the exact clinical name, the result was the same. George Patton had to work for every book he ever finished, and he finished a great many books. He entered the Virginia Military Institute in 1903, transferred to West Point the following year, and was commissioned a second lieutenant of cavalry on the 11th of June, 1909. The next 30 years are the part of his biography most American military writing tends to skip past, and they are the part that matters for the story we are telling. Between the two world wars, the United States Army was a small and poorly funded thing. It was smaller, for most of the 1930s, than the Army of Romania. American tank doctrine had been placed by the National Defense Act of 1920 under the command of the infantry, which essentially froze armored thought for a decade. Patton, denied the chance to keep working on tanks after the end of the First World War, returned to the horse cavalry, where he would spend much of the interwar period. And he read. His wife, Beatrice Ayer Patton, who organized his surviving library and notebooks, later compiled a list of what he had worked through. It is a longer list than most historians of his public career acknowledge. It included Clausewitz's On War, which Patton bought on his London honeymoon in 1910 and finished on the 15th of August of that year, writing to Beatrice that Clausewitz was, in his words, as hard reading as anything could well be. It included Caesar's Gallic Wars, and Marbot's memoirs of the Napoleonic campaigns, and Henderson's biography of Stonewall Jackson, and the collected writings of the British armour theorist J.F.C. Fuller. Patton mailed copies of Fuller's generalship, its diseases and their cure, to 12 colonel friends as a kind of professional gift, noting in each letter that prevention was better than cure. It included the works of Basil Liddell Hart, with whom, his wife said, he often loved to differ. He kept a small notebook of his own. He filled it over the years with what he called military maxims. Some of them he signed as Julius Caesar, some he signed Napoleon, some he simply signed with his own initial. The notebook survives. It is not the reading of a man preparing for parade ground ceremony. It is the reading of a man who, in the quiet decades before his career made sense to anyone around him, was teaching himself a kind of war that had not yet been fought. When the Louisiana maneuvers came in September of 1941, Patton had his first chance to run the theory as a practice. He commanded the 2nd Armored Division, and in the second phase of the exercise, he led it on a 3-day, 400-mile end run through East Texas, swinging his division back into Louisiana from behind the defenders' rear area and nearly seizing Barksdale Field before the umpires could catch up with him. When Lieutenant General Ben Lear protested that Patton had left the designated maneuver area, Patton reportedly replied that he was unaware of the existence of any rules in war. During the run, when his tanks ran low on fuel, he paid for gas at civilian filling stations out of his own pocket. He would not command an army in combat for another 3 years. When he finally did, the man the British and American press would meet was not the meticulous reader. It was the performer, the man with the ivory-handled revolvers and the helmet and the deliberately theatrical voice. The reader was still there. He had simply become a figure most people never saw. There is a conversation I want you to hold in your mind. Before the Normandy invasion, the British military theorist Basil Liddell Hart spent time discussing the upcoming campaign with various Allied commanders. Liddell Hart came away unsettled. He felt the Allied High Command, almost to a man, was mentally preparing to refight the trench war of 1918 rather than the maneuver war of 1940. Even Patton, Liddell Hart later recalled in his memoirs, had told him the Allies would have to go back to what Patton called 1918 methods, because the kind of deep armoured drives the Germans had executed in France in 1940 could not be repeated. Patton, in other words, did not yet know he was about to prove himself wrong. The Third Army he would eventually command became operational at 12 noon on the 1st of August, 1944, near the village of Beauce at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. It was not, on paper, an elite force. Many of its divisions were new. Its commanding general had been kept out of the Normandy landings entirely, held in England as part of a deception plan that encouraged German intelligence to believe the main Allied blow would fall at Calais. He had not in fact been consulted in the planning of D-Day. He had been kept behind the line like a loaded weapon. From the moment Third Army went operational, it moved. Let us look at the numbers, because the numbers are the part that broke the men writing the German situation reports. Third Army was asked to do 3 things at once. Its 8th Corps under Major General Troy Middleton was to turn west and clear the Brittany Peninsula, with the particular objective of capturing the Atlantic ports so that Allied supply could flow through them. Its 15th Corps under Major General Wade Haislip and its newly forming 20th Corps under Major General Walton Walker were to face east and cover the widening gap between the Americans and the Loire River. Its 12th Corps, which at activation was commanded by Major General Gilbert Cooke, had a similar mission to the south and east. Cooke would be relieved for health reasons on the 18th of August and replaced the following day by Major General Manton Eddy. Within a week, the eastern formations of Third Army had captured Mayenne and Laval. On the 8th of August, the 79th Infantry Division took Le Mans, which had been the headquarters of the German 7th Army. By the 12th of August, Haislip's 15th Corps had driven more than 100 kilometres from Le Mans in 5 days and was sitting just south of Argenton, closing the southern jaw of what became the Falaise Pocket. In the pocket itself, the Germans would lose somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 men captured and another 10 to 15,000 killed. Over 500 armoured vehicles were destroyed. Dwight Eisenhower, walking the battlefield afterward, wrote that it had been possible, for hundreds of yards, to walk on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Patton wanted to push further north on the 13th of August and close the pocket completely. His Army Group commander, Omar Bradley, overruled him, worried about collisions with the British and Canadian forces coming down from the north. Patton argued, lost the argument, and kept moving east. On the 14th of August, 2 weeks into the campaign, he paused his morning staff conference to say that in the 13 days since his army had become operational, it had, in his own phrasing, advanced further and faster than any army in the history of the war. It was a Pattonism, the sort of line he liked. It was also, roughly, true. Third Army had covered about 300 miles in 2 weeks, and it was about to cover another 100 in the next 10 days. On the 18th of August, the 5th Infantry Division and the 7th Armoured Division took the city of Chartres after a 5-day fight that had begun on the 15th and that pitted American infantry and armour against the remnants of the German 300. 52nd Infantry Division and the 17th SS, Panzer Grenadiers. At Chartres, on the 16th, a Third Army operations officer named Colonel Welborn Griffith personally searched the Chartres Cathedral to confirm that there were no German troops inside it, then had American artillery fire called off, so the cathedral would not be destroyed. He was killed the same day in the village of Laves, a little over 2 miles north of Chartres. He would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, posthumously, by the United States, and decorations by the French government. The Chartres Cathedral still stands. On the 19th of August, at 35 minutes past 9 in the evening, Major General Wade Haislip telephoned the commander of the 79th Infantry Division, Major General Ira Witche, and told him to get across the Seine River that night. Witche's division was near the town of Mantes-Gassicourt, about 30 miles northwest of Paris. His men found a narrow footpath over a dam. The 313th Infantry walked across in the dark. The 314th Infantry paddled over in assault boats at first light on the 20th. By afternoon, engineers had opened a treadway bridge. By the 23rd, they had a Bailey bridge in. The original Overlord plan had placed American forces on the Seine River on day +90, which would have been the 4th of September. The 79th Infantry Division arrived on day +75. Third Army was 15 days ahead of schedule and accelerating. By the end of August, Walker's 20th Corps had driven across a series of rivers that sound, when you read them listed together, like a history of the First World War: the Loire, the Seine, the Vèze, the Marne, the Aisne, the Meuse. On the 27th of August, the 5th Infantry Division crossed the Marne at Château-Thierry, on ground where American soldiers had fought in 1918 against men whose sons were now the ones being pushed off the river. On the 31st of August, the 5th Infantry Division seized 2 bridges across the Meuse at Verdun before the Germans could demolish them, a capture made easier by the fact that the defenders were scattered and surprised. 20th Corps would collect a nickname during this drive. The men called it the Ghost Corps, for the speed of the advance. The nickname is sometimes attributed to the Germans, as if Wehrmacht staff officers had coined it in their own situation reports. The historical record does not bear that out. It appears to have been an American self-description, and the phrase was adopted back in the United States by newspaper correspondents. The Germans, whatever else they felt about Walker's columns, did not have a standing name for them. What they had was the difficulty of locating them on a map before those columns were already on the other side of the next river. In under a month, from the 1st of August to the 1st of September, Third Army covered about 400 miles from the hedgerows of Normandy to the Moselle. It did this while fighting. It did this while capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. It did this while pulling its supply lines so thin that, by the last week of August, whole divisions were sitting within a day's drive of running out of fuel. The comparison that mattered, to the men watching on the other side, was not to any earlier American campaign. The comparison was to themselves. In May of 1940, the mobile formations of Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel had crossed France in 6 weeks. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division had moved so fast across the French countryside that its own high command kept losing track of its location. The Germans called it the Ghost Division, Gespenster Division, and they meant the nickname in both its senses, admiring and uneasy. On the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941, General Georg Hans Reinhardt had driven his Panzer Corps roughly 500 miles toward Leningrad in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. General Otto von Knobelsdorff had covered some 800 miles in 6 weeks across the same front. Knobelsdorff himself, no modest man, called his own advance unique in the history of Prussian and German military achievement. These are the yardsticks by which a senior German officer would measure speed. Third Army, in August of 1944, was moving at the upper end of that range, and it was doing it with an entire field army, not a single panzer corps, and it was doing it in the 5th year of a war that was supposed to have taught the Americans nothing. I want to tell you about 2 of the men who made that happen, because it is easier to understand Patton's speed when you see the men Patton trusted to move faster than he could keep up with. The first is Major General John Shirley Wood, who commanded the 4th Armored Division. Wood was one of the quieter American generals of the Second World War, and one of the most interesting. He was nicknamed P at West Point for professor, because he tutored struggling cadets. The men of his division gave him a different nickname once they saw him in France. They called him Tiger Jack. A linguist and a francophone, he had studied at the French Army's École Supérieure de Guerre in Paris in the late 1920s, and he had read the interwar armoured theorists, Fuller and Liddell Hart and de Gaulle, and Guderian, more thoroughly and in more languages than most American officers of his generation. On the 28th of July, 1944, 3 days into Operation Cobra, Wood personally led his division into the breach in the German lines. He would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for it. On the 1st of August, with Third Army now operational, his tanks drove into Brittany. On the 4th, they took Rennes. And then Wood did something that made his career and, in the end, broke it. He told his corps commander that clearing Brittany was the wrong mission, and that the war was to the east, not the west. Third Army, he argued, should cut Brittany off at the neck and pivot its armour toward Chartres and Paris and the German border. The ports on the Atlantic coast of Brittany could be screened and taken later. The Germans were broken. Every hour spent reducing coastal garrisons was an hour the enemy was being allowed to recover. He was right in outline and wrong in military propriety. The 8th Corps commander Middleton ordered him to continue west. Wood complied, but not quietly. His biographer quotes him saying to colleagues that his superiors were winning the war, but doing it the wrong way. It took until mid-August for his division to be ordered east, and by then, by his own assessment, a week of decisive time had been lost. When he was finally turned loose, Wood drove the 4th Armoured Division in a way that made the men above him uneasy and the men behind him exhausted. The division covered roughly 400 miles from the Cobra breakout to the banks of the Moselle. It did so by a method Wood had refined over years of reading and thinking. He issued his subordinates clear intent, a clear objective, and very little in the way of specific instructions on how to get there. If the opportunity was in front of them, they took it. If headquarters needed to catch up, headquarters caught up later. On the 25th of August, the 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A, under Colonel Bruce Clarke, reached the town of Troyes, about 100 miles southeast of Paris. The Germans had established a garrison there, with anti-tank guns positioned to cover the flat, open ground west of the town. Clarke had studied the ground. He knew his Shermans would be vulnerable if they approached in column. He ordered his tanks instead into a wide line abreast formation, spread across the plain, and had them charge across the open at high speed, firing on the move, driving through the anti-tank screen before the German gunners could adjust their range. Spearheading the attack was the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, a man Patton would later call his only equal as a tank commander. The armoured infantry of the 10th Armoured Infantry Battalion, under Major Harold Cohen, moved up behind them. A second task force swung to the north and struck Troyes from behind on the morning of the 26th. When Patton came forward to present Clarke with the Distinguished Service Cross, he discovered that his staff had forgotten to bring a spare medal, so he took the Distinguished Service Cross off his own uniform and pinned it to Clarke's chest. Bruce Clarke later described the entire drive from Normandy to the Moselle in a single sentence. He said, "I went 500 miles on 2 words. The 2 words, from Patton, had been go east. This was how Third Army moved, not by the general telling every colonel what to do, by the general telling every colonel what to accomplish and then getting out of the way, and by the colonels having spent enough time in their careers thinking about mobile war that they did not need the second half of the order." Before we continue, if this kind of history is what you came here for, the kind that looks at how these men actually made decisions on the ground, please tap the like button. The men who commanded Third Army's divisions, Wood and Walker and Hyslop and Eddy, are mostly forgotten outside specialist circles, and every small signal helps this kind of work reach the people who care about it. The second man I want you to meet did not wear general's stars. He was a truck driver, and the organization he belonged to was, in its way, the reason all of the above was even possible. By the middle of August, Third Army was running out of gasoline. This is not a minor footnote. It is the single greatest danger of the entire campaign. Third Army and the First Army under General Courtney Hodges were, between them, consuming roughly 800,000 gallons of gasoline a day. The French rail network, which in a normal war would have carried bulk fuel forward, had been systematically bombed to pieces in the weeks before D-Day because the Allies did not want the Germans to use it to reinforce Normandy. In August, the Allies were living with the consequences of their own success. The trains could not run. The solution was improvised over a 36-hour planning meeting in late August by a small group of American logistics officers. The key figures were Brigadier General Ewart Planck, who commanded the advanced section of the communications zone, Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayers, who was put in charge of the truck force and nicknamed Little Patton by his men, and Major Gordon Gravel, who served as operations planner. Planck summarized the mission in one sentence. He said, "Let it never be said that a lack of supplies stopped Patton when the Germans couldn't." They called it the Red Ball Express. It became operational on the 25th of August, 1944. At its peak, it ran nearly 6,000 vehicles on dedicated one-way supply highways between the Normandy beaches and the advancing front. It carried about 12,500 tons of supplies on a good day. Over the roughly 82 days of its operation, ending on the 16th of November, it delivered over 412,000 tons of gasoline, ammunition, food, and other material to the forward American armies. About 3/4 of the drivers were African-American soldiers. Most of them had been assigned to support and service roles because of the segregationist policies of the United States Army of that era. Many of them had not been trained as truck drivers before the war. They were pressed into the role because the emergency required it, and they performed in a way that even the official Army histories, which were not generally in the habit of lingering on African American contributions in 1945, described as extraordinary. Their own words are still on the record. A sergeant named John O'Leary, who served in one of the truck companies running the route, put the job in a single line. He said, "Patton wanted us to eat, sleep, and drive, but mostly drive." A driver named Robert Emmerich, who drove at night with blackout lights, said it was like hypnosis. "You would be watching those damned little lights," he said, "and it drove you blind." An article in the Army magazine Yank recorded a driver named Erwin Rommel saying that truck drivers had been working 20 hours a day, and when their trucks zigzagged on the road, they stopped, splashed cold water on their faces, and drove on. Some of them, he added, died with their hands on their wheels. A driver named Washington Rector, asked later about the segregation his men endured even in uniform, said simply, "You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise." These are not men being paraded as heroes for the convenience of a later decade's storytelling. They are men describing, in their own terms, what it actually cost. And the point I want to make here, because the Germans themselves made it in their private correspondence after the war, is that the thing that let Patton move faster than the Wehrmacht had ever moved in France was not primarily his tanks or his generals. It was his trucks. It was his radios. It was the ability of an industrial democracy to push fuel and ammunition forward on wheels at a rate no horse-drawn army could ever match. The German Wehrmacht of 1944, the same army that had invented modern mobile warfare, still moved most of its supplies by horse. Over the course of the war, Germany employed roughly 2.8 million horses. Its panzer and motorized units were fast, but they were a thin metal skin on an army whose body still ran on hay. The United States, by contrast, produced more than 800,000 2.5-ton trucks of all makes during the war, including over 560,000 of the boxy little General Motors 6-wheel drive workhorses, the drivers called Jimmies. No army on earth had anything close to that industrial base. In the 25th of September, 1944 edition, Time magazine, writing about the pace of the Allied advance, described the Red Ball Express and the supply effort around it as the miracle of supply. The magazine wrote that the miracle was in the American tradition, a tradition the Germans had never really understood. It was begotten, Time said, of a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, to nationwide trucking chains, to endless roads. The Germans had won on horses and engineering. The Americans had won on a continent-sized logistics network run on diesel and bad coffee. There is a third element, and the Germans missed it almost entirely until after the war. Patton's intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had access through a small group of cleared officers to Ultra, the British effort that had broken the German High Command's encrypted radio traffic. Koch's staff, supported by an Army signals officer named Lieutenant Colonel Melvin Helfers, who served as the dedicated Ultra liaison at 3rd Army headquarters, could often tell Patton within hours which German divisions were in front of him, what condition they were in, and what orders they had just received from their own superiors. Every Allied commander had access to the same raw material. Patton's advantage was that he had trained his staff to move at the pace of armoured warfare rather than the pace of paperwork. By the time a German corps commander received Hitler's latest instruction to hold a given town, Patton was often already behind the town. In November, Koch's staff would produce one of the single most impressive pieces of American intelligence work of the entire war, correctly identifying the German build-up in the Eifel for the Ardennes offensive before anyone else in the Allied chain of command took it seriously. That part of Koch's career came later. The part that mattered in August was simpler. He read the enemy faster than the enemy could transmit. So the picture you should be holding in your mind is this. One man at the top, with 20 years of quiet private reading behind him, who knew how to issue intent and leave his subordinates alone. A handful of divisional commanders, Wood and Walker and Hyslip, who had been trusted with intent and had spent their own careers thinking about how to move armor fast. An intelligence service that was reading the enemy's mail in near real time. An air force above them, the 19th Tactical Air Command under Brigadier General Otto Weyland, which had achieved such a complete air superiority over the Loire flank of the advance that German columns could not move on the roads by day. And behind all of it, nearly 6,000 trucks driven mostly by men who did not have the full rights of citizenship in their own country, keeping the gasoline flowing. That is the system. Patton's speed was not his alone. It was the speed of a whole country arriving on another continent at once. But this raises the question the Germans kept asking themselves, privately, for years afterward. If their own doctrine of mobile war was so good, and the Americans had in effect borrowed it, why was the German army the one on the receiving end of it in the summer of 1944? The answer is painful, and it comes out most honestly in the writing of the Germans themselves. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was no longer the Wehrmacht of 1940. 3 years of fighting on the Eastern Front had chewed through the experienced officer corps that mission command required. Mission command depends on an officer senior enough and trusted enough to read a situation in front of him and act on his own authority. By 1944, many of those officers were dead, and they had been replaced by junior men who had been promoted faster than they would ever have been in peacetime. More seriously, the German political system had eaten away at the trust mission command required. In the years after 1942, Hitler had increasingly seized operational decisions for himself, down to the battalion level in some sectors. Field marshals, who had previously been trusted to fight their own battles, were now being told not to retreat without his explicit permission. Commanders who showed initiative were often fired. On the 20th of July, 1944, a group of German officers led by Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg had tried to kill Hitler with a bomb in his conference room at the Wolfschanz in East Prussia. The plot failed. The purge that followed, conducted partly through the Gestapo and partly through a so-called court of honor, claimed Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was ordered to take his own life in October of 1944 to protect his family, and Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who took cyanide in August after being replaced as commander in the West. By the time Third Army crossed the Seine, German divisional and corps commanders were operating in an atmosphere of political terror. The safe choice was always to wait for an order from a Führer headquarters that was too slow, too distant, and too paranoid to issue it in time. The irony is almost unbearable. The Americans, who had never formally adopted a German-style doctrine of mission command, were by accident being commanded in something very close to it. Their junior officers acted without permission because there was no time for anything else, and their senior officers approved of what their juniors had done, because the results were arriving on their desks faster than orders could have been drafted. The Germans, who had spent 100 years writing that doctrine down in manuals and training officers in it, had in practice abandoned it, because a man waiting for the Wolfschanz to reply to a staff query was no longer making his own decisions. Rommel himself, in the last months of his life, was aware of this. In a chapter compiled posthumously from his surviving notes, which his widow and son and his old colleague Fritz Bayerlein prepared for publication after the war, Rommel wrote that in Tunisia the Americans had paid a stiff price for their inexperience, but that the price had brought rich dividends. The American generals, he wrote, had shown themselves even then to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. And yet, he added, we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. This was written by a man who in May of 1940 had commanded the Ghost Division across France faster than anyone else alive. He was not a man given to easy compliments. If your father or grandfather served in Third Army, or drove a truck in the Red Ball Express, or fought under Wood or Walker or Highslip, or was among the infantry who crossed those 6 rivers in August, I would be honoured to hear their name and their story in the comments. Those are the actual record of this campaign. The general does not cross the Meuse alone. A private crosses the Meuse, sometimes 12 of them, sometimes 100,000. There is one more body of evidence, and I want to give it its own moment, because it is the closest the Germans ever came to a full accounting of what they had seen. In the months and years after the war, Allied intelligence officers worked with senior German prisoners on a program of historical studies, producing manuscripts meant to be archived by the United States Army for future officer education. Some of those manuscripts ran to thousands of pages. Some ran to a few dozen. Taken together, they are the single largest body of reflective German writing about the Second World War that exists. In them, asked to judge their American opponents, the men who had run the Western Front kept circling back to one particular adversary. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, asked by Basil Liddell Hart to name the Allied commanders he had considered most effective, gave two names. He said that Montgomery and Patton were the two best he had met. Field Marshal Montgomery, he said, was very systematic, which was acceptable if one had sufficient forces and sufficient time. Patton, by implication, was the other kind. General Alfred Jodl, interrogated by the Americans after Germany's surrender, called Patton the American Guderian. He said Patton was very bold and preferred large movements. He took big risks and won big successes. General Heinz Guderian himself, the father of German armoured doctrine, was interrogated in the summer of 1945. He had not faced Patton in France, but he had read the reports. He told his interrogators plainly that he had heard much about Patton, that Patton had conducted a good campaign, and that as a tank specialist he was obliged to congratulate Patton on his victory, because Patton had acted as Guderian himself would have acted in the same place. And Blumentritt, writing his long manuscript for the American Army Historical Program, returned to Patton again and again. The version of his assessment most often quoted is the one we began with. The Germans had regarded Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man of incredible initiative and of lightning-like action. His operations had impressed them enormously. He had come closest to their own concept of the classical military commander, and he had even improved on Napoleon's rule: activity, speed, more speed. These are not quotes offered to captors as a form of flattery. They are the professional surrender of a defeated generation of German officers, made in private manuscripts intended for internal American military consumption. And the thing they say, over and over, is that the man across from them had done what they themselves had taught. I want to be careful here about what this story is and is not. It is not a claim that by the summer of 1944 the average American soldier had become a better soldier than his German counterpart. The internal German assessments, even the admiring ones, tended to rate individual German infantrymen as more skilled tactical operators than their American opposite numbers, and there is enough evidence on both sides of that question for it to remain a live argument among historians. It is also not a claim that Patton was above criticism. His Lorraine campaign, which ran from the first week of September into December of 1944, was fought on hard ground against a stiffening enemy, and it produced roughly 55,000 American casualties, which amounted to about a third of all the losses Third Army would sustain in the entire European war. The historian Carlo d'Este has argued, and the 1985 United States Army study of the campaign concurred, that Lorraine was among Patton's least successful efforts. The magic of August did not repeat itself in November. The same commander who had moved a field army 400 miles in a month moved 40 to 60 miles in 3 months at Fort Driant and Metz. This is why August matters. Not because Patton was invincible, and not because the Wehrmacht was finished, but because for one specific window of time, a particular American commander, with a particular American army, supported by a particular American logistical system, moved faster across hostile ground than the men who had invented modern mobile warfare had ever moved themselves. And because those men, when they wrote the question down for themselves in the quiet years afterward, agreed that what they had watched was something new. Over the course of its 281 days of continuous combat, from its activation in August of 1944 to the German surrender on the 9th of May, 1945, Third Army crossed 24 major rivers. It captured more than 81,000 square miles of territory and more than 12,000 cities and towns, including 27 cities of over 50,000 people. It suffered roughly 140,000 casualties of its own. It inflicted several times that on the Germans in front of it, and in every month it was operational. From its first to its last, it was moving forward. Patton did not live long enough to explain the whole thing in his own voice. On the 9th of December, 1945, a little after 11 in the morning, His staff car, a 1938 Cadillac driven by a young private named Horace Woodring, was struck at a railroad crossing near Mannheim by a 2.5-ton army truck making a sudden left turn. Major General Hobart Gay, sitting next to Patton, was unhurt. Patton himself had crushed vertebrae and was paralyzed from the neck down. He was treated at the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. He died 12 days later, on the 21st of December, of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. He is buried, by his own request, with the men of the Third Army at the Luxembourg American Cemetery. So here is what you should walk away with, and it is not a slogan, and it is not a salute. Between the first day of August and the first days of September, 1944, an American general who had spent the quiet decades of his career reading Clausewitz on Honeymoon and Fuller at his desk, who had been laughed at in the peacetime army for caring too much about horses, led a field army of mostly untested divisions across northern France faster than any German army had ever moved across the same ground. He did it because he had absorbed a doctrine of mission command more deeply than most of the men who had invented it, and had spent his career building the habit of trusting his subordinates to make decisions he was not there to make. He did it because a handful of division commanders under him, Wood and Walker and Highslip and Eddy, had the same habit, and because the colonels under them, men like Clarke and Abrams, had the same habit again, all the way down to the lieutenants on the point. He did it because his intelligence staff was reading the enemy's radio traffic faster than his enemy could transmit it. He did it because the air above him was owned by Otto Wayland's fighter bombers, and because the road behind him was owned by 6,000 trucks driven largely by black American soldiers who had been told, at home, that they were not full citizens, and who drove anyway, on blackout lights, on no sleep, at speeds above the factory limit of the vehicles they were given, because they knew the men they were supplying could not move a yard further without what was in the back of the truck. The Germans, in their post-war manuscripts, when they tried to explain what had happened to them that August, kept reaching for the same word. Blumentritt reached for lightning, Rommel reached for astonishing, Jodl reached for the American Guderian. Rundstedt, who had been running wars since the 19th century, simply said 2 names, and Patton's was one of them. They did not, in the end, have a better word, because what they were describing was not just a faster army. It was what a fully industrial democracy could do to a continent when the brakes came off, once it was led by a man who had been preparing for the moment long before anyone else thought to look. If this kind of history is what you want more of, please subscribe. There are many more stories from that year, and a great many more men in them, whose names are not on the monuments. The generals are remembered. The truck drivers mostly are not. The lieutenants on the bluff at Omaha mostly are not. The colonels who led tank charges across open plains in French wheat fields mostly are not. They deserve, at a minimum, to be remembered by the thing about them that their enemies, in the end, could not explain. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.